Hello and welcome everyone. For those who I haven't met, my name is Aarti Khosla. I represent Climate Trends. Climate Trends is also the host of this session today, and I'm joined by my colleagues Shivani, Manjari, and a few others who've been working with the authors to put the study together and host the session. Thanks everybody who have joined us today. And let me at the outset say that we are going to put the next 1 hour or so to talk about some very crucial aspects, and our intention is to weave those aspects together. Some of you have been experts in one or the other, but through this session, we will try and find where the interconnections lie. And the three subjects that I'm talking about is essentially finance and investments that are needed, the startup ecosystem in India and where it sits and the opportunities that it has, and how finance and startup can together leverage what could foster climate action. So there are the elements of what we want to discuss on the importance and urgency of climate action, the importance of accelerating finance towards that, and how the startup ecosystem can be the one which can pivot more and more finance towards that end. Very briefly, I will introduce our experts and panelists as well, who will actually carry forward that discussion. But if I'm allowed 2 or 3 minutes, then as somebody who has at least followed the climate media debate for almost 15 years or so, I wanted to just set the context and say, we're all aware, those who have been following the climate debate, on how sticky the discussions on finance are. And even then, climate finance, quote unquote, as it's called, has always remained elusive for a country like India, for a process like the UN process, whether it's the discussions on the Conference of Parties or the Paris Agreement, etc. Even if there is movement, and you see an amount like $8.5 billion being bagged by South Africa for transformation of its utility called Eskom. There is so much discussion on whether this is new and additional, or is it just regurgitated and repurposed from before. And to that extent, at least in the climate conversations, finance has become such a big elephant in the room that now it does not allow for any progress to happen on other fronts even. However, if you look beyond the UN process, it just feels that some churn is happening. And yesterday, incidentally, we saw a news report which mentioned that India sits at number 9 globally in terms of climate venture capital. And just to put it in context, the data was from 2016 to 2021. $32 billion flowed across the world on what can be classified as venture capital for climate tech. And of the $32 billion, India sits at number 9 and it got $1 billion. Now, the fact that it got reported in some news and it was carried by the Press Trust of India, it's a huge amount, $1 billion. And then I was reading the other news on how NTPC is now, for the first time in many years, going to build a new coal power plant in Talcher in Orissa. The cost of that power plant, incidentally, is also $1 billion, just for the sake of comparison. So I think the point is that $1 billion is not enough for a country which is facing the kind of climate impacts that it's facing, and the fact that internationally the money will not come, but the domestic imperative for action will keep increasing. That is what we want to take stock of. Where does India stand in terms of the climate action debate? Where does it stand in terms of the transformative plans which the government of India created through startup mission, and whether that can be used to meet climate goals? I'm not going to talk more beyond the introduction, but I will let our experts do all of this discussion, and we will see where we go with this. Let me welcome all our speakers and experts today. We have Akhilesh, who's the founder and director of Climate Foundation, a startup, if you will, which is focused on bringing attention to climate issues in India. Akhilesh also conceptualized the study, which he will present very shortly. We also have Felix Hubner, who is an independent consultant on climate and energy. with a very sharp knowledge about India and especially the energy ecosystem in India, and is based in Germany. Felix and Akhilesh are the lead authors of the analysis and the study, which will be presented shortly. We have Mr. Lavanya Jena, who is a regional climate finance advisor for the Indo-Pacific region in the Commonwealth Secretariat. We have Ms. Shweta Ravikumar, who's the head of FSR Global Program at the Florence School of Regulation. And we have Mr. Nalin Agarwal, who, among many other hats that he wears, is also the founding partner of Climate Seeds Fund, which is a unique, first of its kind, climate seed startup initiative in South Asia. I welcome everybody who is here. Everyone has invested a lot of their professional career, time, and resource in talking about the subject and researching about it. And I really hope that in the next hour or so, we can come up with some interesting ideas that can take us to the next stage of what we've embarked on. First, let me invite Akhilesh and Felix to present the findings and recommendations of the study that they have done on the status of climate tech startup finance ecosystem in India. After that, we will have a discussion between Shweta, Nalin, Lavanya, as well as the authors of this report. Just to also say that normally in sessions that we host, some journalists and friends from media are also present. Mostly whatever will be said is open to be quoted if a news story is being filed. However, if somebody is filing a news story, may I encourage you to please check back once with the authors as well as the panel on their quote before you quote them. Otherwise, we are recording this session for those who also want to hear the recording, especially for journalists who are filing. The recording will be available publicly and the report will be shared soon. Let me pause and hand it over to you, Akhilesh and Felix.
Oh, namaste to everyone. It's also a pleasure for me to present the results of our studies. Go ahead, please, Akhilesh. When we look at climate finance for Indian startups, there seems to be a paradox. On the one hand, we see headlines such as here from the COP26 in Glasgow: India demands 1 trillion as climate finance, or the great outcomes for the results. And finance eventually was a key topic for the session at Glasgow. Go ahead, please, Akhilesh. The story continues for the discussion in India. So climate action takes a central stage in India annual budget. India calls for ramping up scope, scale, and speed of climate finance. So we see climate finance is a huge topic at international scale and also for the domestic discussion. Next slide, please. We can continue. When we look at some of the global business rankings, we see India moves up 14 spots in World Bank ease of doing business ranking. And some indicators are particularly relevant. So we see venture capital availability, a global rank 22 out of 140. It's fairly good for India. Entrepreneurial finance, or ease of access to entrepreneurial finance, first place among emerging countries for India. So it looks quite good. We go ahead, please, Akhilesh. But then when we look, when we take a closer look on the ground, we also see that the startup environment in India is largely clustered along two factors. One is cities. So startup activity is highly clustered in a few tier 1 cities, that is Bangalore, Delhi, NCR, and Mumbai. Next slide, please. Akhilesh, next slide, please. Okay, so, and we see it's even more clustered by industry. So the largest chunk of VC finance in Indian startups goes into IT, a bit of banking, a bit of healthcare and logistics. But what we can see is that climate startups are really underrepresented. Next slide, please. And when we look on the ground, we see really, on the other hand, there are huge mountains to climb for entrepreneurs. Some quotes that we received from our interviews with entrepreneurs in the climate tech area in India were such as, I have a personal debt of 25 lakhs. I needed grants from friends and families and own savings for the venture in the beginning. I had to put a mortgage on my own house to secure finance, otherwise the banks would not give me money. Or in general, it's very hard to find funds for pre-seeds or seeds finance. So go ahead, Akhilesh. There really seems to be a paradox. And there was one study from the Climate Finance Initiative who pointed out to the concept of the missing middle. And that is when we look at the stages of startups in the beginning, in India, there's a fairly good availability of funds for early stage ideas from universities, from Startup India, from labs. And at the end, as Aarti also mentioned, for more mature established companies, there's also an active VC environment in India. However, in the middle, when it comes to scaling up of startups, there's a persistent funding problem. And that is what we refer to in our presentation as a missing middle. So that is from the seed stage over the early stage to the growth stage to the extent over to the expansion stage, where it is really difficult for climate tech startups in India to find means of finance. Next slide, please. So what to do? How could a remedy look like? That is what we would like to present today and give some ideas, some food for thought. Let me continue with a few short definitions to make clear what we are talking about. So we are talking about climate finance, and what does climate mean? What does green mean? What does sustainable mean, or low carbon? It's not entirely clear. And we refer to a definition from the United Nations. So for this discussion, climate means technology for climate change mitigation or climate change adaptation. Next slide, please. And what we are talking about is climate finance for startups. And a startup is a young company that comprehends innovation and growth. And these are the two critical elements that distinguishes a startup from a normal SME. And we're talking specifically about the missing middle, that is from the proof of concept to the expansion phase for startups. And so now to present ideas, it's also worthwhile to look outside of India and see where else in the world there were vibrant startup environments and ecosystems, and not necessarily a good idea to reinvent the wheel. And of course, there's a lot of activity in the Silicon Valley. There's a lot activity in the UK, otherwhere in the US, also in China. For the sake of simplicity, we refer to one example, and that is from the European Union. Go ahead, please, Akhilesh. And that is the EIT InnoEnergy system. It was established in 2008 by the European Union, but has always been operated as a private organization. And the EIT InnoEnergy received only initial funding from the European Union and has private stakeholders such as large conglomerates or universities. Besides acting as an impact investor for startups, the organization has also a strong focus on education with master programs and professional training along the entire value chain. Next slide, please, Akhilesh. And what we can see is that EIT InnoEnergy has created a significant and successful track record. Today it is ranked among the top 10 accelerator and incubators globally. It has invested in more than 240 startups. It has created 2 unicorns. And what is important to point out is that the support goes far beyond finance. So the support also includes support for marketing and sales, accounting services, HR services, strategic services, connections to policy makers, and so on. And now I would like to hand over to Akhilesh to present a bit more in detail how such an idea could work in India too.
Sure. Thanks so much, Felix, for that introduction. Just to sort of conclude and take forward the idea and meet some of the gaps going ahead. So we've seen that climate finance startups are really lagging behind other IT and e-commerce startups, which India has traditionally been strong at for obvious reasons also. So we've also seen that there appears to be a gap in funding, what is known as the missing middle, from a very initial stage prototype to scaling it up into the market and making it big. So there's a huge gap between that, which critically needs to be addressed. This is a problem. We need to mention that not just for climate startups, it's a generic problem, but perhaps exacerbated or accentuated in the climate space. Given the fact that climate startups tend to be much more capital intensive, it's much more difficult than 4 or 5 college students getting together to develop an app, for example. So a lot of interactions with policymakers, regulated space. So it's a far more different and challenging environment. And that brings us to point 3. The investor expectations, usually, especially in India, but also indeed globally, is the expectations are really shaped by other startups, primarily IT, e-commerce, which, as I said, needs a far lesser threshold in terms of capital investment and so on. And we think that this inhibits the growth of climate startups. So there is a need to carve out a specific space for climate startups. Very important to define what climate means, as we saw in the slide earlier. As I said, carve out a very specific niche for this. And the fourth important point is we saw a very strong geographical clustering around a few cities. The key question is, how do you really go and distribute this across India? Now, unfortunately or fortunately, startup activity and hubs, innovation hubs, is not something that can be planned top down. It's also very organic. And so it's dependent on several factors, including access to investments, mentors, education hubs, and so on. So that's something that needs to be kept in mind, especially if we talk about equity. The key question really for us as authors on this report is, how do we make it easier? And can we first make it easier? And how do we make it easier for climate startups to access finance? And I think that's where we've come up with an initial idea, which we want to put it out there, get feedback, develop on this, and actually implement this on the ground in India. Essentially, what we want to do is we feel there's really the need for the government to come in and catalyze the sector initially, very similar to the EIT model. And so that's something that we looked at. It's important to do this to minimize the risks that a lot of lenders especially see in the climate space, typically longer gestation periods, and you're dealing with different set of demons here. So we see the need, at least initially, for the government to come in and act as a catalyst for the de-risking, especially de-risking the environment. The good news is the government is already implementing support to startups through the Startup India scheme, which has been fairly successful. There have been challenges, but it's certainly better than nothing. So through the existing network of incubators and support programs, there is a possibility and potential to carve out a special climate niche here. Now, long term, we feel that the government must make sure to not make this too bureaucratic. You want an approval, it shouldn't go to Delhi or to the state government. The power to take decisions on startups should really, especially funding them, should be held locally, especially at the incubator level. So it's very important. The government plays an important catalyzing role, but it shouldn't become a typical bureaucratic process. Very, very critical point. The third point, which we feel is we want to set up a blended fund, as the figure on the left shows. And a blended fund essentially gives you access to debt, equity, and grants. Grants for initial prototypes, university students, initial ideas, etc. But as the startup goes through its phases, which can be seen on the bottom there, from say the pre-seed, seed stage to a growth stage, the funding requirements of startup vary very dramatically and very quickly. For example, one example could be access to working capital, short-term loans, which can really cover the salaries so that people don't leave, the team doesn't get disbanded, and so on, at fair interest rates. So this is where the government can come and give access to this, work with multilaterals, bilateral development banks who are traditionally risk averse, who don't want to burn their fingers in the startup space. So by de-risking this, by the government coming in, these three portions, the debt, equity, and grant, can really be played around with. And here you can have on board angels, other seed funds, HNIs, everybody participating in this to really make this democratic in that sense. What's also very important, as I think Felix mentioned, the last point is this must come with a host of other ecosystem services, which is getting better over time in India, certainly access to mentors, knowledge networks, and so on. We have Nalin here who's doing a lot of this. However, I think in the climate space, it's very difficult to get mentors, people who've been there, done that. We don't just have that track record yet. So I think building this kind of access to not just local mentors, but also global mentors can be very, very important, but also access to labs, because most of the startups in the climate space, are likely to have a product. And so the product needs to be tested. It's a tremendous amount of prototyping facilities, lab facilities that need to be made available at a reasonable rate, or at least at a subsidized rate. So these are the kind of support structures that are extremely important in addition to finance. Finance is a critical, but certainly not the most essential thing. So this is an idea that we have, and what we want to do, especially as a part of this, as this is discussion, is open up the floor for discussion, get your comments, get constructive feedback on this, and then take it to at least the state level, perhaps even the national level, and see if we can work with a host of incubators, accelerator programs, etc., to actually make this happen. So that's the idea, and this is my last slide. I'll end here, and Aarti, maybe we can open up the the webinar for discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Akhilesh. And if I can paraphrase what you basically said, there is a lot of progress that must happen. The startups in IT, banking, healthcare, etc., have behaved in a certain way in the country, but the climate startups are a beast on their own, and therefore a lot needs to be done. And what you're proposing is some kind of a finance facility where different kinds of money and investment can come through various channels, and that can be facilitated by the government and can meet the needs of various debt, equity, grant, etc., which startups can get and take care of their early stage troubles. I think that's a lot to get into for all our panelists who will have various different takes on it. Maybe I will go in an order and invite Dr. Labanya Jana first, then Shweta, then Nalin. But Labanya, with all the time that you have spent on tracking climate finance, I have a couple of questions. You can wrap them into one answer, but you can take 7 to 8 minutes, and likewise for Nalin and Shweta as well. I mean, first of all, is there a need to even diffuse ambiguity between what is green finance, what is climate finance, what is sustainable finance? Or as long as startups are getting the money, it's fine and it can work? Second, given that climate finance is so geopolitical, at least people like us understand climate finance in very oversimplified terms of long-term finance of $100 billion. If that is not coming and will not come in the future, what can be other options? And third, how can the government support climate tech in India, given that there is so much gap that this research study shows? Your mute button.
Yeah. Thanks, Aarti, for inviting me to speak in this event. I'm not a doctorate yet. I'm still pursuing my PhD. So Yeah, coming back to climate finance definition per se, as Alexi mentioned that sustainable finance is very an umbrella term. So you are covering environment, social, and governance aspect. Then under that, there's green finance, which is basically climate finance, plus biodiversity and other environmental aspects. Then there is climate finance, which is basically defined. It's divided into two parts: climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And this is a very, very simple terminology. But the issue in the financial community is that there are other terminologies as well, like for example, ESG, responsible finance. All these terminologies are creating a lot of confusion. Even last week, the Economist came out with a cover story about ESG, and they suggested that okay, drop S and G from ESG. It's not going to save the planet. So it means that it is creating a lot of confusion among the financial community. Even when I speak with any investor, they are saying, okay, I'm going to invest my money in ESG. But at the same time, if you ask any academic researcher, they will say that, okay, by just investing in ESG, you are not saving the planet. And that the company is actually camouflaging their activities by saying that, okay, our ESG rating is very, very high, which is not helping. It is also a very big problem in the International Climate Finance Forum, particularly in the context of the support the developed countries has promised in 2015 Paris Agreement will provide you $100 billion per annum to developing countries for their climate actions. Nothing has happened actually. One is the definition is a big challenge. For example, the OECD definition, as per the OECD definition, the amount of support from developed country to developing countries is 80 billion or so, 75, 80 billion, still lower than 100 billion. But if you see the government of India's came out with its own analysis, they say it's only 1 to 2 billion. Okay, so the issue is that how are you defining this support? For example, if Goldman Sachs is investing in renewable energy, don't put my name, Goldman Sachs. So is it a support from developed country to developing country? I don't think so. It's a purely commercial transaction. So we cannot say that the support is given by developed country to developing countries. But according to the definition of UNFCCC, it is not clearly defined whether the capital coming from developed country or to developing country, whether it is concessional or not, or commercial in nature. Developing countries are totally denying that if any money is coming at a commercial way, so it cannot be considered as a support by developed country to developing country. So it's a big issue. That ambiguity needs to be clear in the political circle, international political circle. Second thing about climate mitigation and climate adaptation, it's also a big challenge because most of the capital actually coming to climate mitigation. So the reason is that climate mitigation is mostly, commercially feasible in nature because it's easy to identify the beneficiaries of climate mitigation. For example, you have renewable energy, clean transportation. You can identify the beneficiaries, and the beneficiary can pay the user fees. But in the case of climate adaptation, it is completely public good. Mostly, it is completely public good. You cannot differentiate from one beneficiary to another beneficiary. So you would see that the amount of capital is currently flowing to climate adaptation is minuscule compared to climate mitigation. So that's another challenge. The reason climate mitigation is getting a lot of attention because it is a public good. For example, if India is generating energy by deploying renewable energy, it is helping everybody in the world, including the donor country and the recipient country. So it is also a political win by the developed country. They are also, you can sell in that political market. Okay, we are also promoting climate mitigation, not only in our country, but in other countries. But that's not the case of climate adaptation, because the beneficiaries and local people are people of that country. So that's another challenge, I can say so. Can you repeat your second question? If you can, sorry.
That was mostly, with respect to what was presented. What does our government need to do, for example?
Okay, so it's rightly mentioned that, whenever we are talking about technologies, particularly, I heard that half of the climate technology are still in the laboratory. It will come to use after 20 years or so. So it means that we can understand that how much time somebody has to spend in that technology and spending huge amount of research and development in the next 10 to 20 years or so. So if we talk about, it's very popular to know that angel investors, venture capitals, they invest at a very, very early stage, but that's not true actually, including in the countries like United States, Europe, particularly on the research and development stage, you'll not find a lot of angel investors are currently investing, even in the corporate sector as well. So here, even if the developed countries, the government has given a lot of capital in the form of grant during research and development, because you don't know whether the technology will be successful. I mean, most of the time, technology.
Lavanya, sorry to interrupt you. Can you remove your earphones and then speak? So I think the oscillation in your sound will be less. Can you remove the earphones and speak into the laptop? Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, let's try.
Okay, so when we're talking about new technology, so I mean, it will take a long time, because I read somewhere, so half of the climate technology is still in the laboratories. So it will take many, many years. Actually, these technologies will be deployed at a commercial rate, at a scale. So it means that a lot of capital they need for next many, many years, many, many decades, I can say so. So, I mean, it is a popular notion that angel investors or venture capitalists, they also invest at a very, very early stage. Here we are talking about where the success rate is less than 10% or so. But that's not true actually. Even if we talk about countries like United States, here the government actually spent a lot of money on the research and development expenses for any technologies, you touch semiconductor or any other technology or computer technology or so. Here you are talking about climate technologies, which are going to create public goods, I mean, which is going to generate a lot of positive externalities. So here the government can play a very, very important role. One is that at a research and development, definitely they can provide grants. But on the other side, the government can make money out of that, particularly at a early stage investment, when you will see that, okay, venture capitalists or the angel investors, they may not be interested to put their money as an equity investors at a very, very early stage. Maybe, for example, there is Startup India Fund, through which the government can participate as an equity investor, not like a grant maker. Grant making can only happen at the research and development stage, where you will hire a lot of professor researchers. Okay, they may not be equity investors, they may not come out with the technologies. The idea is not to use the technologies, so they may not be well equipped. But once the technology crosses certain hurdles, there is a possibility that that technology can be commercially feasible. Maybe the possibility is very, very slim. At that stage, maybe the technology company may be struggling to get capital from venture capitalists or angel investors. There, the government can come in and support them as an equity investors. Then you will see that the venture capitalists or angel investors can come in at that stage. Then another great big stage actually where the government can support, particularly in the commercialization stage and scale stage, because at that point of time, as an equity investors who are supported at very, very early stage, they would not like to dilute that stake in a company, in a technology. So in that case, they need huge amount of debt financing in particular, where the risk is very, very less. But the issue is that when we are talking about debt in India, we talk about only commercial banks, and the commercial bank will ask everything except they would like to know the cash flow generation of your business. They will say, okay, show me your house, show me your equipment, show me the collateral. So they will not ask you, okay, what is the expected cash flow generation from your project. In that case, from the new technology financing perspective, the government can provide debt financing for a longer period of time at an appropriate rate. I can say at a better rate compared to any other debt financing. One is that there is a challenge to access of debt financing. Then even if they can access to debt financing at what rate? Here the government can play an important role by providing debt capital at a rate which is appropriate, so that the equity investors, they can take risk as well as increase the scale of operation.
All right. You said many things. Towards the end, I think what I picked up was you have points on how the government can provide debt, equity, and loan. Maybe in round 2, we will come back to why this has not happened, because, the climate targets are the pet project for India when it comes to projecting an international image of climate action. But at the same time, in the last 5 years, we've also had Startup Mission, in whose principles I think innovation and tech are quite inbuilt, and so is sustainability. So what does it take for one department or one ministry to speak to another, or is it something more than that? I mean, if you're saying all of these things, I'm assuming that all of these things have been discussed before. So why is it that progress hasn't been faster than what it is at the stage? But we will come to it in round two. I also wanted to invite Shweta at this moment. And Shweta, you know, when Felix was presenting, he showed how climate tech is quite different and a lot of emphasis has not been given in India. Anyway, we as consumers also see a lot of focus on health, IT, banking, etc. And, you know, in your view, what brings the integration between investments and clean energy goals? And I'm saying clean energy specifically because, at least from India's point of view, climate targets are mostly perceived as mitigation goals, renewable energy targets, electric mobility targets. 80% of you know, our plans for emission reduction are mostly also the energy goals. And to that extent, there is a new concept of just energy transition, and all the discussions that developed countries might advance or put forward money into developing countries. India can be a recipient of such funds, but again, there seems to be no money on the table. So, twofold question to you. What will bring together finance for clean energy goals? A general question. And a second question pertaining to the report, given how things were presented, that there could actually be a fund which could be created, do you have views on what could give impetus to the climate tech finance ecosystem in India?
Thank you so much, Aarti, for having me on this panel. I think it was a great presentation by Felix and Akhilesh. So I'm going to answer your question as a sort of interlinked response because the two sort of go hand in hand. I think first and foremost, what we need to understand when we talk about transition is it's not the same, and we're all not in the same pace across the world, right? So particularly bringing in another concept such as just energy transition need not mean the same things, say if we're talking in Europe or if we're talking in South Africa or in India. Again, if we were to also look at similar geographies such as South Africa and India, while on the face of it, we might be talking about similar issues, South Africa being again a very coal-dependent country, same in the case of India. But when we are trying to transition away from that scenario, we are again at different levels of development. South Africa, you did mention in your opening remarks about ESCOM, they are just about in the beginning stages of unbundling their energy sector, as a consequence of which they are taking in new measures, very bold, I must say, but still they are very much in the early stages of, say, the market liberalization process in South Africa. Whereas in the case of India, we're actually quite progressive, and we have made a lot of strides in that front. So here the question is not more about setting those sort of regulatory measures in place. It's already there. It's about how we leverage what's already there. So I think just energy transition could mean two different things there and here. Of course, if you look at the scenario in India, we see that most of the states that are impacted by just energy transition are in the north and focused there, or the coal mining states particularly. But the renewable energy investment or clean tech investments need not necessarily be in the same states. They are more distributed in the southern parts or western parts of the country. So I think there itself lies the discrepancy, because this topic is so socio-political and climate linked. We cannot sort of just replace investment in one with this problem lying elsewhere. So we need to really look at how to do this transition in a much more holistic way, considering that people are part of the solution and also part of the issue in some sense. So keeping that in mind, we'll have to see how states can collaborate. And I think this is far more challenging in the case of India, because energy and other issues are sort of a concurrent subject. So while India can make a lot of goals at the national level, how it translates at the state is a peculiar challenge that we face, simply because that's how the governance of the country works. So here we'll have to work at both these levels if we have to make any true impact or inroads. So I think that's already challenging on simpler issues. So something this complex will really take the might of everyone in the sector to move things on that front. So yeah, And as far as clean energy investments is concerned, yes, there is a lot of money that will come into that, but also we cannot shy away from the fact that fossil and fuels will be a part of the Indian energy mix for the longest of time, simply because we are a growing country in terms of our energy demands. We are dependent on resources, be it for renewables or for fossils from every part of the world. So we'll have to see how to transition in a way that our grids have the power on when we want it. So we have to look at also stability issues. It's not just about investing in technology for generation, which is where most of the focus lies today, but we also have to look at solutions that sort of stabilize our grids to take in all this influx of renewables in the Indian networks. So I think there lies an opportunity for many startups to come up with new ideas and solutions, particularly with smartening of the grids that's happening. So I think that's one. So if I were to sort of just broadly highlight some of the key challenges I see just at the top of the head, I'm not a finance expert, more on the policy regulatory space, but I do understand that we need to understand the space in order to develop the solutions, right? So I think first and foremost is information asymmetry, even amongst us. I think Lavanya did point out there are so many different nomenclatures and definitions and terminologies. So I think we need to just cut the clutter and simplify it for people who are trying to develop solutions. An engineering team sitting in one of the IITs couldn't care less about the jargons. They just want to develop the solution. It's for people like us who want to take it and implement it. So we need to sort of tap into that interest in a very strategic way, so that people feel like they can actually contribute and then not get lost in the terminologies, and probably they are developing solutions, they just don't know where it fits. So I think that is one. And I think likewise also on the practitioners end, or on the, say, the policymakers or the investors, they also need to be educated on how these different solutions that might be mislabeled are actually part of the solution. So this needs to be facilitated, and I think this should be an ongoing process all along. Two, I think Felix did mention a very important point in his presentation, which is about the EIT InnoEnergy model that Europe has so successfully implemented, which brings in both skilled workforce, at the same time giving them the opportunity to come up with solutions. And I think that's one of the most important things that India definitely needs. I see that we do have a large number of people coming out in terms of our degrees, but are we skilled in the right way to utilize what we have been taught? I think that's the challenge of conversion that we see in India overall. So I think we need to skill people right, or have complementary programs where they can sort of harness what they already know and be able to add value to the sector at large. So I think that's another challenge we have to overcome. And I think there we have to go multidisciplinary. You cannot just come up with solutions anymore in silos now. Then in terms of the third point, I would say is we need to go beyond energy. So I think I would go with the larger banner that you said, talking about sustainability, because if you see now, it's no more about just energy solutions, or say, while we were doing this debate, I just looked up the top 100 unicorns in the climate finance. It's all transport, agriculture, energy, three of these subsectors that come up. And I think in today's world, all of these overlap very well. We have energy, agriculture nexus. We're coming up with lovely solutions, Gujarat model case in point. We have EVs, again, energy transport. So I think we need to also enlighten and be aware of when sectors do come together, what are the risks and opportunities that come with it, and how should, say, the startup world align itself in terms of solutions. So I think that's that. And I think if my proposal would be to the team that's floating this report is, we should have some sort of an all India portal where people can actually be able to find this kind of a data. If I were a student in a college and I'm curious and I'm passionate about doing something, but I don't know how, I need to be able to know where I can focus my energy. So I think something like this, where we can give them the trends, the opportunities, and sort of where the requirement could be a good start. Two, we also need to see, I think one of the important points that your report did bring out is that all of the funds are concentrated in some cities or states in India. If we need to migrate beyond, then we need to also skill them up beyond in those states. So when we are trying to do things at the speed of light, which is what we need if we need to meet our climate goals, it's only natural that you go to the usual suspects because they're already trained, skilled, you know what to expect, and you get answers immediately. But if you want to also expand it to other geographies in India, we need to scale them up quickly, else the usual suspects will eat the cake and then it's concentrated in a bubble. So I think that will come if we in the sector collaborate more. It's not just about calling for people to come forward, but we need to talk more and align ourselves a bit more to speed up this process and gain inroads into India. So I think, yeah, I think if we achieve all of this, then we will start off with more companies coming up with solutions, particularly in this, I would say, in the smart grid space, and probably also overcome the challenge that we have in the sector, which is we have large incumbents who themselves are investing or trying to come up with ideas. But the plus point is, if startups do have good solutions, they themselves will get absorbed into these huge giants. So I think, yes, we need to be aware of what the scenario is in the sector, but at the same time facilitate and give them this long-term transition opportunities for the startups. So I think that will be my quick opening remarks to you, Aarti, and then probably we'll take it up as we go along.
Perfect. Again, I think lots has come out between everything that you said, from flexible grids to agriculture. Incidentally, one study Azim Premji Institute did where they analyzed, it's not related to startups, but it just reminded me because it came 2 days ago. Between 1999 and 2019, they analyzed how many parliament questions were asked, which were either about climate change or had allied association to climate change. And so of the total questions asked in the parliament, 0.3% were questions which were on climate change or on associated issues of climate. And this also includes, things like why wheat sowing in a particular constituency is lesser and all of that. And even then, it's not even 0.5% of the total questions. So when you talk about government should act, in the end, government is not bureaucrats alone, and the needle will actually move with politicians. And if that is the level of understanding of politicians, then really that's a long way to go. But maybe, that deserves a startup of its own. But that said, Nalin, lots for you to cover. I mean, everybody has said what they think about various aspects of how to define finance, what are the interesting bits of how government can act. Also, how focus is, like Shweta said, transport, agri, energy. I also have, a combination question for you. First, what is your reflections on the report itself? It's a unique report that, Akhilesh and the team have tried to put together, linking climate tech and startups. And what do you think is the nature of that conversation? And second, I also want to know from your perspective of being hands-on, what in your view is the role of government and what more can they do?
All right. Thank you, Aarti. Okay, I'll start, of course, with the report, which is both timely and relevant today. Sorry. I think climate finance, especially early stage climate finance, is something that I've been. Sorry, Lavanya, do you have something? Oh, okay. So early stage climate finance is something that's very close to my heart, and of course what we do for the last several years. So I'm very glad to see more work in this space. This report lays out, of course, the groundwork for what the status is today, what can be done, especially by policymakers, but also sufficiently well informs other stakeholders in the space, right? So very glad to that it's come out, and I believe more such will come out as we go, because much more is needed in India. It goes without saying. What I'll do is I'll just kind of share some context about the space. Again, from a practitioner working with startups, right? So, so there's a very famous IEA graph that shows nearly a quarter of the technology that is needed to get us to net zero is today in very early stage, on prototype or even like pre-prototype stage, right? And what we've seen over the last few decades is startups continuously demonstrating that they're able to take on invention and innovate quickly and reliably so that products become deployable and usable at scale. So there's a very critical role that startups play in our economies today, right? Now in India, originally when startups came in the climate tech space, they started servicing the growing base of renewable energy assets, the wind and solar So most of you may know this, but we are either the fourth or fifth largest in solar and wind. So we're a relatively mature and sophisticated renewable energy player globally. What we've seen over the last, especially 2, 3, perhaps 4 years, is startups growing in mobility. As you know, mobility is very, it attracts a lot of funding and interest, but also in waste, circular economy, carbon tech, natural resources, clean industry, and to an extent, even advanced materials, right? So what we're seeing is climate tech is becoming broad. All sectors are growing, but each of them have different challenges. For example, mobility and energy would see a lot more funding support. There are different challenges from, let's say, waste and natural resources, which are as important but need different kinds and perhaps more support, right? Someone did mention this. Taxonomy is also something that needs to be standardized in climate tech because it's so broad, right? So that's kind of the startup situation we're seeing. More specifically, a few positive trends. There's greater talent moving in, right? So we're seeing entrepreneurs, even among those we support, that have exited other sectors, are getting into the space. More and more job seekers coming in and wanting to get into the space, right? We're seeing more funds come up, early stage funds, late stage funds, climate tech focus, agnostic with climate tech interest, India focus, and international with the India interest, right? We're seeing a few hundred. Yes, we're seeing a few funds that are aiming to be 100 million plus funds focused on startups. What we've seen, of course, is that Series A capital and beyond is much more mobile across borders. Early stage capital still requires local capital, right? And that is largely the early stage funds which are local. And we don't see so many of those, right? Which is speaks to what Akhilesh and Felix have identified as the missing middle, right? So something we've also seen. Now, what does climate tech need? Of course, it needs specialized support, right? Why is that? Oftentimes, there's longer development periods. You have longer sales cycles, perhaps you have longer product development cycles, and you need founders and investors who are domain experts. They need to understand it. Oftentimes, this is deep tech, right? So the critical bit is that we need investors who understand the differences that climate tech represents, right? We need newer funding structures as well. So in addition to VC, which can only support a certain type of business model, we need blended finance, we need revenue-based financing, we need essentially more patient capital, right? That's kind of an overview of what we see and how we see the space, the early stage climate tech landscape, right? In terms of what government can do, of course, there's many things, but I believe what government can do is be an enabler, right? Government should set up more centers of excellence, right? We know that the principal scientific advisor to the government of India is doing this in conjunction with the corporates. It's finding problem statements, finding capital from the private sector and setting up centers of excellence. It can do this more, right? What it can do also is enable and strengthen the industry academia interface. We see that in Europe and USA and the US, sorry, where this is quite strong, and this leads to a lot of other spillover effects, right? I also feel that states can do more, right? Not just central government. The states can step up to try and attract investment directly, both domestic and international. Some states are doing that, and they can do much more. Indian states are massive entities, and they have a lot of resources at their disposal, right? Other thing, as an enabler, government can do perhaps is to set out stretch goals. Like stretch goals are essentially perhaps 5 to 10-year goals, but with a large ambition. So city electrification or port electrification, right? And all it needs to do then is set up an enabling policy and regulatory environment with long-term certainty, right? And a favorable tax policy where possible, right? Doesn't need to have capital outlays by the government, just be an enabler again, right? We can also look at BIRAC-like bodies or CCAMP-like institutions for climate, right? If at all government wants to play a role in direct funding, perhaps a credit enhancement mechanism is something that they could support in very well. I don't think government needs to be, and I don't think it intends to be in the business of selecting startup winners. So that's already good. The other key thing it can do, and someone did mention this earlier, is greater investment in fundamental and applied R&D, right? We've seen this time and again, like investment in R&D leads to lots of spillover effects. In fact, the genesis of Silicon Valley can be traced to a lot of R&D capital that went into defense and space. So this is something certainly it can do, if at all there has to be capital outlay, right? The final thing, of course, is something that we've talked at length and a lot is power sector reform. Electricity plays a critical role in modern life, and it will play a critical role in the clean energy transition. So distribution reform, which is kind of taking a longer timeline than we would all have liked. So distribution reform, even including content carriage I mean, the separation of content and carriage to introduce new comparative dynamics. I think these are things that everyone knows actually the last bit, but it just takes some time to get there. But I'll stop here. I think, Aarti, back to you.
Thanks, Nalin. I think when we go now from here to the second round, there must also be a question on what kind of solutions are we looking at, and given internationally the whole discussion on things like net zero is also laced with a lot of greenwashing. So what solutions are being proposed so that they are real solutions? Maybe a chunk, as you said, is just energy and transport. But if things have to be mainstreamed in India, like you said, it has to be on other things like waste management, urban infrastructure, perhaps, etc., which doesn't seem to be the case at the moment. But a lot has been said after the report findings were presented. I still have a question to all the three panelists on what do you make exactly of the recommendation of creating that fund, which was presented towards the end of those recommendations. But before I get into that, maybe I will invite Akhilesh to share some of his thinking, because a lot of inputs have been made by everybody after you presented, Akhilesh, and there is lots of statements on what government can do, both as an enabler as well as an equity investor, as somebody to give loans without collaterals kind of thing. There was also a question in the comments that it's always difficult to get loans and scaling up is a problem. So just in terms of where the theory of what you have proposed lies to the reality of what should happen, what are the kind of 2 or 3 main things that you picked up from what our speakers said are worth prodding into more?
Thanks, Aarti. I think firstly, there seems to be an agreement with the findings of our report, right? And I think that's good news. I think in terms of the government support, I'll just dovetail your question to our experience of working with entrepreneurs, my experience of working with entrepreneurs and incubators in Gujarat. I mean, just from my experience, I can tell you that the government has spent a lot of money in building prototyping facilities, lab facilities, etc. A lot. And this is not something that we saw even 8 years, 5 years down the line. All this capital investment into what Nalin mentioned, R&D facilities have come in over the last 2 years or so. So I think we should start seeing the yield of this 1 or 2 years down the line. Already a lot of entrepreneurs are benefiting from this. For example, it could be something very simple, to simple machining tools, right? You want to build a prototype and you go into the lab, you have the material, you use steel, aluminum, build what you want to build in a week's time, which was unthinkable at a university level incubator about 5 years ago. You had old lathe machines, what you had in first semester, second semester, what everybody studied, engineering, things like that. So a lot of very sophisticated machinery has actually come in. 3D printers, for example, for very small prototypes are here. This is something people can access. And the good thing is anybody outside, whether within the incubation center, within the university, typically anybody can access this. And that's a good sign. We still have, I think, a long distance to go. But it's great steps. Second, on the funding itself, if you look at the Startup India scheme, right? Entrepreneurs, really, even students can get access to something, as it may be a small amount, but it's the ease of access is something that's improved. A couple of lakhs, 3 lakhs, 5 lakhs is forthcoming. And if the idea is good and the committee says, yes, these decisions are taken at the incubator, I need to emphasize, it doesn't have to go to the state government, but up to about 20-25 lakhs is something that incubators already have the power to approve. It's a significant amount given how India has operated traditionally, especially with regards to outlays. And it typically comes very fast. So it's not that you have to wait once a year for these rounds. Every month you have a round coming up, etc. The third important point, I think, there's a lot of open innovation startup schemes. Nalin has done a lot of this. So even from the non-governmental sector, this has really improved in very specific thematic areas. Even if you look at the Startup India scheme, agriculture-based innovation challenges have been announced, or defense-specific, etc. I haven't personally seen a climate-specific, you see, but this is something I think we can certainly work with and work towards this specific area. So a lot of very interesting developments, but I think the gap really is on the is also on the innovators. We don't see those high quality innovations coming in. Maybe there's, out of 100 applications, there are like 2 or 3 that are really interesting. Most of them that I see and evaluate are really an app based that's trying to connect something, trying to build a marketplace. Very few targeted products or services that are actually addressing climate adaptation and mitigation measures. Very, very few. Most of them are much simpler ideas. That's obvious because it's easy to put an app together. But even in the climate space, real innovation, I find it not forthcoming. Why? I don't know. I think it's a larger systemic issue of R&D culture missing, etc. But it's improving. You see, one interesting cultural change is a lot of students want to start their own firm. This is an interesting social change which we didn't see when I graduated. I don't know, 10, 15 years, but it was some time ago. But even like 5, 6 years ago, you got out of a graduate program, you got out of college, and you took a secure job. Maybe an IT job, or in a good company, Reliance, Adani, Siemens, Bosch. That number of students taking up these secure jobs have drastically changed, and I think that's perhaps an interesting precipitator, an indicator of something interesting coming up in future. So I see positive changes, but there are these constraints that I mentioned, and I'll stop here.
Can I ask you, Felix, anybody else on the panel, when you say that all the solutions are very app-based and there is no innovation really on finding out real startups focusing on mitigation and adaptation, are there any good examples in India and across the world on what those good startups are which are focused on mitigation, adaptation? Because as a user or a consumer as well, if somebody asks you what are the 5 or 10 things that I can do to be climate friendly, even after putting a lot of time on the subject, I really sometimes feel at a loss. So it feels to me that the subject itself is so complicated, maybe that a climate solution will not come tagged as a climate solution. Maybe it will come tagged as something which is better mobility or decentralized energy, or just, I don't know, better ways to sow your crops so that you have advanced information. I'm just making up things, but I just want to hear from the panel that if innovation is lacking on mitigation, adaptation based climate startups, are there examples in the world on what those can be? Felix, feel free to come in as well if there are any from the land of the energy vendor.
Yes, of course. I can give a few examples. So one example is what you see in India a lot. I mean, so this one here is glass. But you see a lot of plastic cups, a lot of plastic waste for food delivery. And so one way to reduce the overall carbon footprint is to use recycled material, or not to use disposable, but to produce reusable glasses and cutlery. So it's a small example, but it's something that, I mean, I think everyone can imagine in daily life. And for a more capital intensive example, a big discussion in Europe and in the US is batteries for EVs, because those batteries today mostly come from China, and with a strong historical automotive industry in the US and Europe, there were several discussions. And so that's a typical example of something that you maybe don't see immediately, but that is part of your daily life when you move. with your two-wheeler or your car. And a battery factory is certainly very capital intensive venture.
Agree. And, yeah, not everything has to be capital intensive. I like the power of, simple things. And India has now the regulation on banning single-use plastic, and anyway, that's gaining a lot of traction. But I'll let Lavanya also come in.
Yeah, so another actually, huge opportunity in the space of carbon air technology, which is, some of the companies in United States are doing that. Because the amount of carbon there in the atmosphere is huge. That is another reason actually this kind of technology are not getting traction, because they don't know who is going to pay that. For a company who is going to remove carbon from the atmosphere, who is going to pay that? But in the case of carbon capture storage, it's the company which is emitting carbon. Okay, so they will pay for that. But the company who is going to capture carbon from the atmosphere, nobody knows who is going to pay that unless you have some carbon credit system like in the European Union or so. So that's one of the constraints actually. Many climate mitigating technologies are not coming up because they are not very.
Abanya, sorry, we don't hear you.
There are some issues, I think. I don't know what's happening. So, for example, the case of climate mitigating technologies, because many companies, they don't know what is the source of their revenue. It's easy in the case of renewable energy, in the case of clean transportation, but in the case of simply somebody who is just mitigating climate technology, he doesn't know who is going to benefit out of that. So, in that case, carbon credit will be very, very important piece, because the corporate can understand that, okay, this will be the amount of carbon I'm going to capture from the air. By selling that carbon credit, I can get some revenue out of that. If that is not very, very clear to the corporates or the investors at a very, very early stage, so there is a little possibility that they are going to invest a lot of money in this kind of technologies, because they don't know. For example, carbon price is only 25 tons in European Union. There is no carbon price here in India, at least directly. In that case, why somebody is going to invest unless he knows that who is going to pay for that technology also. Thank you.
Just a quick addition. I think we are in the early stages. I think this decade, we just at the start of this decade. Perhaps one thing that we notice is that most startups that are doing innovative work are B2B, right? Or B2G in some cases. So it's not that the consumer sees these innovations very easily. They are just coming up now, in fact. But however, we do see some class-leading startups already coming out from India. There's an automated energy audit company that's a world leader. That's an Indian company. There's companies that are doing, as actually Felix mentioned, bioplastics that have a natural remit now to do something unique because of the recent regulations. There are companies doing business model innovation. And keep in mind, there's fundamental problems to be solved in India in many sectors, right? In waste, in circular economy, right? So fundamental problems don't require high-tech solutions. They require excellent delivery. They require the ability to scale, reasonably and inexpensively and operate reliably, right? So lots of companies are solving it. To me, that's innovation that's needed. And we see that a lot of innovation is just taking something that's available and making it usable at scale and deployable at scale and reliable at scale, right? I think that's happening in India today. It's important to separate also mitigation and adaptation, because you mentioned this. So mitigation, of course, is seeing much more action because it's easier for the private sector to fund mitigation, right? Adaptation is that much harder. But again, we are seeing innovative solutions, especially, for example, in satellite mapping, in climate risk modeling, in forecasting. Both actually forecasting is getting better and better in India because, again, there's a renewable asset base which has intermittency, or right word is variability, which requires a lot of technology development in order to kind of get to high levels of grid penetration. So that technology spurred by the private sector, by the IPP sector, is going to get into other sectors as well. So remote sensing, early warning systems, I think we need some little bit more work. Drone-based monitoring, we're seeing water hydrological forecasting, we're seeing a bit more stuff happening. So that's just something we're seeing in the early stage pipelines. And hopefully some of these will scale up and we get to see them more and more.
Understood. So, we at least we have harvested some ideas from you all, and it's not just theoretical. Shweta, before I go further, and Lavanya, is this an old hand or a new hand? New hand? Okay, Shweta first.
Yeah. Thanks, Aarti. Yes, I think just tying into what you and Akhilesh did flag, again, the issue of tags, and sometimes we don't probably see the breadth of ideas that we would expect when you're having these rounds. I think, as I said in my opening intervention, I think awareness is key. If I just take the example of the EV space, right, it has everything under the sun. It has that one can offer in terms of services. You can have apps that can help you locate charging stations. You can have someone just setting up the infrastructure, that is the unit which will charge. You can probably have innovative financiers who are giving you good subscription plans with the ones who are sort of setting up the infrastructure if you were to go. Or you can also have a bit peeking into the future. You can have software companies that are acting as e-aggregator platforms with smart automation and things coming in, who can sort of leverage by trading on the open market and sort of give more gains to the consumer. So you have very many different parts to the ecosystem, probably just that the people say in the IT sector probably are just not aware. They already have the products and solutions there. They just need to be retrofitted into another sector for a new application. So I think this cross-sectorial discussions also need to sort of take place if we need to unlock these business models that we're looking at in the energy sector or climate in general. So I think, yeah, so I think EV is one great place where transport, IT, you have energy, and of course, the role of partnerships, which is also an important kind of, which you also flagged before, is important to sort of leverage cross-sectorial synergies. So I think, yes, so there is opportunities. It's just a lack of us knowing or reading it the right way.
Understood. And certainly, there will be opportunities. If somebody as conservative as the Reserve Bank of India yesterday issued a paper to say that there will be a consultation on climate change, then these discussions are not devoid of, even the highest decision-making places. And climate is becoming a determinant in policy making. It's no more how paddy cultivation is being impacted, but really it's gone much, much deeper. And without getting into the politics of the situation, next year is G20. India will be the host of G20. And you can already see that action happening in various places in Delhi where they're trying to put together some plan, or mostly a framing of what we will say our climate ambitions and targets are. And this year, ahead of the COP, apparently India will also make a written submission of, the Panchamrit strategy, Felix, mostly like the 5-point nectar, whatever program of the government of India, which talks of 500 gigawatts of renewables and 50% energy installed from renewables, etc. So clearly, the government is seeing a lot of climate action in terms of announcements and statements that it can make internationally. And Nalin, the way you said, enough has already been done in terms of recognition by the government on what needs to be done. It just simply feels that the connections haven't been made very strongly. I want to utilize the next 10 minutes to go back to that single question, which was on the slide that Akhilesh presented last, which was a unique idea of a new facility or a fund, or Akhilesh can frame it better, but a climate blended fund, mostly, like a new venture, which is supported by the government, which can turn into reality all the conversations that we are having, bring funds from various sources, bilateral, multilateral, venture capitalists, etc., and act as a conduit and allow that routing to happen from where it is to where it should go. And I wanted to ask, Nalin, yourself, and Lavanya and Shweta, on what exactly do you think that recommendation is about. You can agree, disagree. It will allow us, if you disagree, it will allow us to do more. If you agree, it will be very boring, but let us at least hear your views. Lavanya? Should I put up that slide? Akhilesh, do you mind putting up that slide?
Actually, blended financing is a very, I can say, a very discussed terminology. Many times people say that people overestimate the use of blended finance. Okay, how much capital it can mobilize. But if you see that in last 6-7 years since the blended financing discussion have been in the sector, so it has not been so successful. One of the reasons is that there are not enough data available how blended financing is actually able to create additionality. When we talk about blended financing, it has two objectives: two additionality. One is financial additionality. It means that by using public capital, how much private capital you mobilize. That one part. Second part is developmental objective. It means that by using public financing, how much developed, what is the public impact, how much public goods you have created. And that kind of performance record is not there. From the public sector financing perspective, they would like to know, and everybody would like to know that, okay, by using this fantastic instrument, which theoretically looks very, very good, how much private financing you have mobilized? You will say very, very little. But at the same time, how much development impact? You will not see many data available around blended financing. So this kind of, I can say, misinformation or lack of information, both to private investors and the public financiers, is not helping. Secondly, when we're talking about blended financing, we need to see that appropriate structure of the blended financing, whether the return is aligning with the risk assumed. And number two is that how much risk the public financiers are taking. One of the reasons private investors are not really interested in blended financing, because they have a feeling that the amount of risk a private investor is assuming in a blended financing structure is not enough. I want the public investors, public financiers should take more risk. One of the, actually, even in the case of development financial institutions, particularly World Bank, ADB, or IFC, actually, when they created many decades back, their objective is to provide risk guarantee. Their objective is not provide just grants or lending or providing equity capital, for in the case of IFC or so. Their role is to provide guarantee, risk guarantee, which can be used to raise commercial capital. But that's not the case, because if we see the balance sheet of World Bank, out of the total capital they have disbursed so far, I think 3 to 4% has only be used for guarantee. The rest of the money is lending, grants, or maybe from IFC it is equity. It's not guarantee. So it's sometimes also there is also evidence which suggests that they also crowd out private investment. It is really, really sad. Okay, so it means that when we are talking about blended financing, we need to see that whether public investor, public financiers are assuming the risk, and the risk actually is aligning with the private investors. Then the accumulation of record. Then another critical point about blended financing is to originate projects and connect with investors and financiers. Because in the case of climate technologies, many technologies are a startup. So there is a possibility that there is a disconnect between the investors and the technologies. What happens in the case of development finance institution phase, many times they originate technology, they originate projects, but they do it for themselves. They don't invite co-investors and co-financiers. They can do, that's their objective. One of the objectives of DFIs is to mobilize private capital. That they do that. So the blended financing mechanism, or it can be intermediary, it can be a fund. So can they originate projects and connect with investors, not necessarily just providing capital, but with connecting investors and play the role of financiers where it can optimize the use of public finances. Thank you.
All right, I think let's go around the room. Your comment mostly that there is not sufficient historical evidence on how additionality can be created if you do blended finance. Nalin, any views on creating a finance facility like it was shown?
Sure. Again, I mean, in these funds, especially government funds, etc., the devil is in the details. So, of course, we need to be sure that, as Akhilesh has mentioned in his comments, that does not become too bureaucratic, right? Again, Lavanya has raised some pertinent points about the efficacy of such, but what I'd like to focus on is that there's a missing middle, certainly, that you've identified on the startup side. There's also missing middle for funds. You will go to DFIs. DFIs cannot support anything less than a $50 million fund, right? Because they cannot invest less than 10 million, and they will not invest if they're typically more than 20% of a fund, right? So it's this early stage, seed stage funds which can be supported by, for example, a fund of fund structure, right? And there's where perhaps government can play one role. Now it is trying to do something like that, of course, through that 10,000 CR fund that is broadly for startups, and is working through, of course, some of the government NBFCs and banks. Perhaps there can be a more specified or more targeted fund of funds for climate startups, and that too focusing on supporting what we call early stage capital providers, right? Because again, as I mentioned, the late stage funds, they are more mobile across borders. And therefore, we need more local capital to be able to deploy and support a critical mass of early stage startups. So that's my limited view here. We do need something, of course, and what you have identified could be one solution.
All right, Shweta, any views on this?
Definitely, I think I'll agree with the speakers before that there is need for the R just to achieve the scale and size of things that we need to do in our country. But yes, as I do agree with Nalin's very important point, the devil is in the details. And many a time when you have these large scale initiatives, good opportunities are missed because of you have to tick some check boxes which are mandatory from the governments, which need not necessarily fit the mandate of the call. So yeah, we should try to make these a bit more realistic in achieving the goals and not just sort of pick some quotas that we have to. So I think, yeah, that would be one of the challenges that I foresee. But yes, also the second is what Lavanya did mention, data is an issue overall, I think, in our sector. And I think even to make informed decisions on whether or not a particular technology fits the bill, or for me to even, if I were to start a startup tomorrow, if I need to project a business plan and give you market statistics, I would have to struggle to know where my product fit and what's the scale that would reach, because data is really not something that we are strong on in this country. And I think their credible data will be important for us to actually evaluate the potential of these business plans that these startups would make. So I think, yeah, definitely go for the funds too. We need to strengthen in terms of giving them the tools and the resources needed to be able to leverage and come up with some good ideas.
All right, I think in the last 2 or 3 minutes, it's best to hand the mic to those who put the last couple of months to do the study, and that's Felix and Akhilesh. But clearly, there is lots that has been said on impact that is needed, the value of innovation. Something is needed, but whether it's blended facility or not, etc., etc. But at the same time, anyway, I think every conversation with respect to finance on climate only ends in turmoil. So I will not be surprised if this one also ends in turmoil, because the answers really are not easy, but one step at a time. Any reflections, Felix, Akhilesh?
Yes, I would be happy to share some concluding remarks. One is, from my experience, one must be very careful when looking at something that worked elsewhere and then say, great, it's a Silicon Valley, I want to have it in India too. Or let's see, wow, that works in Europe, and wow, Beijing has such a vibrant startup environment. So what we're proposing is to look, what are principles that have worked elsewhere? What are good ideas? and also look at the site conditions and see what is the situation on the ground in India and how can we adapt such a solution to the specific conditions in India. The second point is also from research, it's quite clear that government does not replace private capital, it rather multiplies private capital investments. So to be very clear, we do need the private sector. We do need angel investors, we do need banks, and we do need VCs. Our proposal is rather we see a market failure in a certain segment, and the government can give an incentive to provide a solution along with the private sector, not to replace the private sector. And the last point is India is huge. And so this one is one idea that we developed, and there are certainly many other ideas, and they can work all together. Because again, we are talking about 1.3 billion people in 30 states. And so such a solution may work in one state, it may not work in another state, or not equally. So that's also something we should keep in mind. I stop here, I hand over to Akhilesh.
It's never good to have the last word, right? So that's what it said. But I just wanted to, I had the same point that Felix made, the third point. This is not the solution. What's I think really important is to, and is often missed by a lot of researchers, is the importance of hand-holding. Really being there on the ground, working with various stakeholders in a very specific, small geography to start with. Look at what the gaps are very specifically there. Look at what the thinking is, especially from the government side and the investor side, and really build something that that needs to be piloted. And then, of course, you then take this to other places and scale it up within the state, outside the state, at the national level. These are discussions which can be had parallelly. And very importantly, diversity and flexibility is the key. We really don't have a silver bullet solution. And I think I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Akhilesh. I did mean this to be the last word and we can wrap up. But if you don't mind, can I go through some of the unanswered questions in the chat? And I see there are some. Would any of the panelists want to address? I think there was a question, Akhilesh, that what are some of the tech-based climate solutions? Something about small-scale entrepreneurs, helping farmers, marginalized communities. Do you have anything quickly to say? Tech-based climate solutions, what can they be? Or what do you mean by them? I think the panel did address all of this actually.
Yes, I think we defined climate tech. And tech essentially means any technology that can really further the cause of mitigation and adaptation, right? That's really a broad terminology again, right? So any solution that can further this cause is really essentially what we would say is a tech-based under the climate space. What was the other point on the farmers? Actually, let me go through this actually.
What are the hardware solutions that will help farmers, marginalized communities, etc.?
Yeah, any technology, right? And the key point here is in startup is, as Felix mentioned in his slide, is it must be innovative, right? So it's not an MSME, maybe a fabricating unit based out of Rajkot or somewhere else. So a critical component of a startup is innovation and growth. So as long as these two are included in whatever technology that we address in the climate space, it's fine.
There is one question which I want to pick up because of the contentiousness of it, which is on carbon dioxide removal. And it says what are the various aspects of CDR tech development in India, and it feels like more and more these issues will come up, the more there will be a lot of noise around it. But if you can answer, anybody can answer very quickly on the implications of CDR, and is that also real or just false? Lavanya, Akhilesh, anyone, because I'm imagining both of you will at least have a sense of CDR type stuff.
Not really. So I'm not a technocrat also. So I excuse me for this.
Nice pass.
I don't know enough, unfortunately, Aarti, of CDR. Shweta, maybe you do you? Have you looked at it?
I think it's okay. I mean, CDR is not, one silver bullet. Carbon dioxide removal will be a portfolio of various technologies, various investments. The question will be which one is desirable, probably which one is not. And in the world, as much as we study, there is only one pilot on CDR, which probably has been scaled up. So it's also really untested technology. And with so much having done on many fronts, do we really want to focus right now on CDR, or can we focus on other things? I think is a no-brainer. But Akhilesh, last final word now. We are on
I
top
think
of the hour.
it's a question of a business model. Really, if you establish a business model, then technology, will address that issue. Right now, I mean, the question is who pays for carbon and what's the price? I think those are the really important questions. So that's still not clear to a lot of people.
Perfect. I think at this point, I will have to end. We are just on time. Thanks everybody for participating. Thanks to everybody who joined. We had a very good attendance, mix of colleagues from various organizations, sector experts, also journalists. Key conclusions and trends are with everybody to see. It's a report that we will put up on the website and you can access it there. But many thanks to everyone here on the panel for joining us today. Have a good rest of the day and a nice week. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.